Okay, so here's our fish. Now we can all see this. So this will kind of go over how the fish gills work. And we kind of talked about this the last couple days. I do like to show this slide because I think it really makes sense when you see everything connected. So first up, we have water flowing in through the fish's mouth, and then it actually leaves through the gills. Now, while the water's moving through the gills, what's happening is, you can kind of see it because it's darker, the water's darker in the beginning, and then they're showing it that it's getting lighter kind of as it's coming out. What they're kind of trying to show you there is, as that's happening, it's losing oxygen and it's picking up carbon dioxide, all right? So that's kind of how the water just flows through the fish. Now, here's that counter current exchange in the gills. So this is each of these tiny little gills. This is what's happening in there. You have your deoxygenated blood moving across this way in one direction, all right, against the flow of water. So the water's going in the other direction. And the reason, and that's the first thing to understand, is just that they're moving in opposite directions, all right? So as long as you understand that the water's moving in one direction and the blood's moving in the opposite direction, you are halfway there to understanding what's going on, all right? So that's what's going on. Now the why, that's the second part of this. The why is this diagram that we talked about last time. So this is the new water coming in. It has as much oxygen as it can. We're calling it 100%. All right, the number's just arbitrary, but it has the maximum amount of oxygen that it's going to have. And what it's doing is it's interacting with blood that has already started out on this side and has moved across to here. So the blood and the water, they're kind of just passing each other real quickly. And so what's happening is this oxygen is going into the blood, and that's always happening because as the water moves across, this water is losing more and more oxygen, but it's interacting with blood that has less and less oxygen in it. So there's always a gradient. So when the blood starts off on here, it has a very low number like 5, but this also has a low number, but that low number is still higher. So you can still have diffusion going from the water into the blood. And then as this blood moves across, it's interacting with different and different and different water, but it's getting more and more oxygen as it kind of goes through there. So if we were to follow one red blood cell through this process, where it starts out at 0%, let's say 0% oxygen, as it moves across, its number's going up, and the same red blood cell, as it moves across, is interacting with different water because the water is moving in the opposite direction here, all right? And it's picking up more and more oxygen as it goes. So that's kind of the brilliant thing with this, is that because they're moving in opposite directions, you can get more oxygen into the blood, all right? And that's the basics of it. Now, if you're still like, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, on my YouTube channel, I did put that other video in there that I think will help you out, so you can always check that out. The book also explains it. I could also just be making this more of a big deal than it really is, and you're like, yeah, we get it. We got it yesterday. Move on. And if that's what you're thinking, right now is your lucky moment because we are moving on. Just kidding. Gotcha. All right, so what would the maximum percentage of the water's let me actually read this. So what would the maximum percentage of the water's oxygen no, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's not just big. What am I trying to say here? Now let's say, all right, if they're flowing in the same direction, what's the maximum percentage that you can get? So if the water's moving in this direction and the blood's moving in this direction, what would that be? We talked about it yesterday. Does anybody remember? They're both moving. All right, so let's go through it then. I tried to make this quick, but you don't remember. All right, so if the water's moving in this direction, and the blood is also moving in this direction, right? Blood starts out real low, right? Let's say 5, and then it goes up to like 25, and then let's say it gets to 50, right? And I'm just making up these numbers. Now let's look at the water. Water starts at 100, right? Oxygen goes in, then maybe goes down to 75, and then this one goes down to 50, right? Now once they're both at 50, would oxygen continue to go into the blood? No, it would stop, right? It would reach equilibrium, which means it would just keep being 50 for both of these as we continued. So if they were both moving in the same direction, the most oxygen you could get into there would be 50%, all right? Because again, once they hit the same, it's not going to keep on going in there because this is all diffusion. Goes from a high number to a low number. If they're the same number, it's not going to keep moving. But with this one, when they're going in opposite directions, we can see that the number can get higher because by going in opposite directions, you can have more water diffusing in, more oxygen diffusing into the blood. All right? Got it? Don't make me do another slide on this. You sure? All right. Cool. Hydro flask. Nice. All right, so the next section we have here is on the tracheal system. And this is in insects. All right, so this one's pretty fascinating because they don't use their circulatory system to move oxygen. They actually have a bunch of kind of holes throughout them where they can have oxygen and air go right from their from the outside world right into their cells. All right, so compared to water, I'm not getting paid for this Hydro Flask advertisement. All right, just full disclosure, I'm not sponsored by Hydro Flask. I don't want to, to do, If they pay me though, I'll definitely promote them. If they want to give me free Hydro Flask, I'm 100% on board. But this is not a paid ad. All right, so compared to water, using air to breathe has two big advantages. Man, can't talk today, Caitlin. Can't do it. All right, so air contains higher concentrations of oxygen than water. So us breathing on land is great because we can get more oxygen every time we breathe in than fish can. If you think about like fish brain sizes and whatnot, they're usually going to be smaller than ours for a lot of reasons, but one of them is we're able to power such a large brain by having a lot more oxygen available to us. And if you're like, well, what about dolphins? Remember, dolphins are mammals, right? They have lungs. They have to breathe air. They don't get their oxygen from water. Okay, anyway. So since this is talking about the word concentration, and we might not have heard it used scientifically, it's very basic. What it basically means is that concentration is the amount of substance in a given space, which is very similar to like when you're talking about density. All right, so air is lighter and easier to move than water. Animals that breathe air use less energy than animals that extract oxygen from water. It's easier for us to get oxygen out of air than it is for water, like fish, to get their oxygen from there. However, air-breathing animals lose water through their respiratory surfaces, so they have to stay hydrated. So that's the link to the Hydro Flask, right? We need to keep drinking water because as you breathe out, you're losing water, all right? Now fish, they're not losing water, right? They're always in water, so they don't have to worry about that. That's why you don't have fish carrying around Hydro Flasks when they're in their schools. Get it? Because schools of fish? No? All right, I'm trying it. Man, can you imagine if fish had to like stay 6 feet apart? Those schools would be like super. All right, anyway, I'm on a tangent. One other thing. Did you guys ever see SpongeBob? Isn't there like a character that has to always like have her like tank of or air, right, so she can move around? What's that character's name? Sandy, right? Is she a squirrel? What is she? Yeah, she's a squirrel. All right, so yeah. So she has to bring her air with her, which is easier, right? I don't know if SpongeBob or any of those guys ever went on land, but if they went on land, they would have to have a suit filled with water, right? And carry the water around with them. That would be way heavier. I'm sure they had an episode like that, right? But I don't know. I haven't seen it in like 100 years. Okay. So insects. We were talking about insects. Insect tracheal systems use these tiny branching tubes that reduce water loss, and they pipe air directly to the cells. So the tracheal system structure. Respiratory surfaces for animals with tracheal systems are at the tips of these tiny branching tubes inside the body. This greatly reduces the evaporative water loss because it'll basically be all just air until you get to the end here, and at the ends of it, it has like kind of like a liquid membrane so that the oxygen can diffuse into the cells. And I'll show you a picture of it in a sec. The largest of these tubes are called tracheae, and they open to the outside of the body. They're reinforced by rings of chitin, which we talked about before, right? Chitin, it's one of our, what was it, it was a carbohydrate, right? It was one of the carbohydrates we went over before. Oh, maybe I should just keep reading. So chitin is a fibrous substance consisting of polysaccharides and forming the major constituent in the exoskeleton of arthropods and the cell walls of fungi, all right? So there we have chitin. All right, and let's talk about how this works. So when a bug breathes, what's happening is this in here allows air to go in. When it breathes in, the air goes all the way to the cells of the body, and this part that's kind of blue, that's the moist part. So that's the part where the oxygen will actually diffuse in there, and then it can diffuse into the cell directly. So it's really neat because these are all throughout the insect's body, and so it can kind of breathe throughout everywhere. And these go directly to all of the cells in the body. It's kind of like if you've ever seen like Die Hard, the movie. Did you guys ever see Die Hard? Well, anyway, there's this dude that basically climbs through the ducts in a building, which are basically like, you know, if you've seen movies, they're kind of like these square things, and then there's vents into the rooms, and, you know, you can kind of crawl through them and whatnot. That's kind of how their system works, where there's all of these open areas that air can move through, all right, to get that oxygen in there. Pretty difficult to see it from the actual microscope image here, but this is kind of the basic idea of it. And then some of the more complicated insects, especially ones that'll fly, they'll have these things called air sacs, and that just holds extra air, so they can actually, you know, do this while they're kind of moving around. And even with some insects, actually flapping their wings causes this ventilation to happen faster, so they can get more air in there. More gas exchange can take place. They can make more ATP, right? And then they can fly for longer periods of time, which is pretty cool. Because as you guys know, flying takes a lot of effort. So they want to have as much oxygen in there as possible. Okay. So in large portions of the tracheae form air sacs near organs that require large supplies of oxygen. The smallest branches are called tracheoles, and they extend to nearly every cell in the insect's body. They have tiny tips with closed ends that contain fluid, which was blue in the drawing. Gas is exchanged with the body cells by diffusion across these moist epithelium, and that lines the tips. And epithelium, this is thin tissue forming the outer layer of an organ or a body's surface. Do you know what epithelium we have? Like, can you say, hey, that's epithelium in your body? What's your epithelium? Any ideas? Yeah, it's a weird question, right? But what's my epithelium? Where is epithelium? Can you touch epithelium? It's really interesting. So the answer
is it skin?
Yeah, it's really good. So skin is your epithelium. So if you touch your skin, you're like, oh, there's my epithelium. That's great. Now, here's another interesting thing too, because your organs, they have epithelial cells too, or epithelium as well. So like if you were to reach into your body and grab your kidneys and take them out, which I highly don't recommend, the part that you would be holding, that would be the epithelium of the kidney. Or like in Indiana Jones, when that guy rips out the heart, like he's holding the heart in his hand, that's the epithelium of the heart, all right? So it just means kind of like the outer layer. And usually you think of it as, if it was possible, if it was like a Mr. Potato Head kind of a thing, like those are the parts that you could hold on to. Although I don't think Mr. Potato Head actually has like kidneys and stuff, right? Because it's just like eyes and whatnot, but I don't know. Not brought to you by Mr. Potato Head. All right, so the tracheal system allows gas exchange directly with the body cells. Thus, the circulatory system is not involved in transporting gases. In mammals, humans, our circulatory system is how gases are exchanged. So our blood carries our oxygen throughout our body, but insects, their blood doesn't do that. they have these little tubes that it's just air, and that's how you can kind of move these things through there. Okay. Any questions with any of that? No? Any interesting thoughts on any of that? It's kind of interesting, right? All right, so in small insects, this tracheal system is enough to supply the insects with enough oxygen. Larger insects and insects that can fly, they require 10 to 200 times more oxygen during flight. So flying does take a lot of energy. These insects use their muscles to ventilate air into and out of their body so that they can get enough oxygen for them to survive. And ventilate just is literally just moving air from outside of your body into your body. So like, have you heard of like ventilators? Kind of popular now with the whole pandemic and whatnot. The purpose of the ventilator is it's a tube that they stick into your lungs pretty much, and they're basically pushing air in and then letting air come out. So it's kind of like forcing that part. Now your lungs still have to do the diffusion part, right? But the actual movement of getting air into your lungs and out of your lungs, that's what the ventilator does. And by flapping their wings, that kind of helps insects get that in and out. And it kind of in the same way you can think of with the fish with their, their gill flaps, that kind of ventilates it, moves fresh water in there, which then allows more oxygen to get out. All right, so tetrapods seem to have evolved in shallow water. And so this was kind of a transition from living in water completely to living on land. So it's kind of interesting and it makes sense that they basically had, like, they were fish, they had legs, they also had both lungs and gills, so they could kind of like push themselves up and like gulp air. Because remember, breathing from air is much better because you're going to get more oxygen that way. And the fossil fish, the first one that they kind of saw with this was the Tiktaalik, which lived about 375 million years ago. And it had both gills and lungs, which is pretty neat. So kind of here's the fossilized remains of it. And it's kind of hard to see what's going on here, so they kind of labeled some stuff to make it a little easier. But here's the head. You have the little eye sockets in here. You have a little neck, some shoulder bones, so it could do some push-ups and push itself up out of the water. And then when it pushed itself up, then it could gulp some air, and it would be super happy about that because you get more oxygen from there. So that's pretty neat. Now, from that, there were three major groups that kind of diverged from there. We had amphibians, which makes sense that they kind of came out earlier because they did both. They had lungs, they have gills usually, which is pretty good. They can use their body to absorb oxygen as well, as long as they stay wet. So they were pretty resourceful. Then there's also non-bird reptiles. These are kind of like your cold-blooded, they're referred to. And the only reason that they're cold-blooded is just because they have a lower metabolic rate and they have simpler lungs. And the warmer they are, the more active they can be. So they're really dependent on their environment. And then birds and mammals, they have higher metabolic rates. Birds because they need to fly, and then mammals, I don't know why. They're more complicated. They like to move around faster. It's actually good because they can actually regulate their own temperature, so they're not dependent on the external temperature. So if even in like the cold, like it's freezing outside now, you have mammals running around outside, they don't have to really worry about like the weather heating up like reptiles would. So that could be why. It's just a better adaptation.